So let's go ahead and tackle the challenges here in Bubble 6, starting with 6A. So we want to update the alien's rotation. So if you go ahead and run the default code, you'll see that there's nothing problematic about this code. The code works just fine. The green alien's got a little case of the shaky shakies, and we want to do the exact same thing for the pink alien. So if we look at the code here, one thing to notice here, here's this frame rate code. Before we actually tackle this, let's change the frame rate just so we can see how this works. So I'm going to change this to a much bigger number like 30, and you can see that the green alien is shaking much faster. So what they're really saying when they're saying frame rate is how fast do we want to go through that loop statement? Well, by increasing that number there, you're going to make it go through that loop statement much faster, which means every time that this movement is called, it's going to occur more frequently within a given time frame, whether that's a second, a minute, an hour, whatever. All right, it's going to happen more frequently. If I slow this number down or lower this number to slow the effect down, maybe something like 8, well, we could go even slower than that, maybe 2, and rerun the code, as you can see the shaking slows way down, and so does everything else. So the frame rate, as you can see, is really impacting there how fast that motion we want it to occur. Sometimes slowing it down is really nice for the purpose of debugging, because we have an opportunity to look through the code kind of line by line and see how it executes, especially if there's an error that pops up in one line. But otherwise, set the frame rate based on what you need to happen. Okay, so I've put the code back to the default now. Let's go tackle what they actually want us to do here. So here's the code for the alien, and notice there's no rotation code here, because remember, if something's happening over and over again, it has to be inside the draw loop. This is not the draw loop, so it wouldn't make sense that it would be up here. Down as we scroll, now as we scroll down rather, here we can see the things that are happening over and over again. So this ellipse command is the one that's actually drawing what looks like kind of like that random star that we see that's popping all over around in the background. This right here in line 21 is the code that's making the rotation happen. So we just need to mimic this code for the pink alien. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll go to sprites and grab a rotation block. And remember, this other sprite is called pink alien with a capital A on the word alien. And then you just have to decide what range you're willing to accept there using a random number statement from the math options. So you could go exactly with -5 and 5, or if you want to make it shake more, pick or to a greater span rather, change it to something like -10 and 10. Right? And that's the code we need for the rotation. So B takes us back to a more traditional debugging task. So as we run the code, we can see this is a blender that's got a case of the shakes. But one thing that's odd here is we're never getting rid of the old blender. The new blender is just constantly being drawn on top of previous versions, which is why this blender 2 looks a little wide. So what is the fix? So you might initially be tempted to say it must be something to do with the background. But notice the background is inside the draw loop, which is exactly where we've learned it should be to cover up previous versions. Rather, the issue in this one is the location of the creation of the blender itself. Notice in lines 5 and 6, the blender is created every single time this piece of code is run. We don't need the blender to be created every single time this code is run. We just need it to be created one time. So lines 5 and 6 need to be taken outside of the draw loop. Everything else that's inside the draw loop can stay right there. And as you can see now when I run my code, because the variable or the animation is only created one time, the previous one is always covered up by the background code and we get the desired result. So in C now, quite the opposite here. We expected the blender to move, but in this one the blender does not move. So we want to try and figure out what's wrong here. So I'm hoping this one is just kind of jumping off the page at you. The one thing that's problematic, not even from this chapter, but from a previous lesson, is the location of draw sprites. Remember, sprites should be at the end of your code. So we want to go ahead and take this draw sprites and put it down here underneath, but inside of the draw loop. And when you go ahead and run your code, as you can see now, the motion is occurring, which is one problem fixed. However, by doing that, we have created a new problem, very similar to the last one, is that we're getting this kind of wide looking blender because the previous image is never being covered up. But in this one, it's happening for a total different reason, because notice the variable is created outside the draw loop. Rather, the background is only drawn one time in this one. So we need to take this background code and put it inside the draw loop, and preferably first. Right. And as you can see, once we add that, we rerun our code and everything is correct.
Da-da-da!
So it's time for your assessment bubble. So in this one, notice there's a model that we're aiming for here, and there is some code that exists, but not nearly enough. So we have a variable called salt, which creates a picture at 200, 200, and salt is the picture of a salt shaker. And we have a background code and a draw sprites code, but what's gloriously absent is the draw loop. So you need to go ahead and add the draw loop so that the salt shaker has the exact same effect as the model. I'll leave you to do this one on your own. This is a great place to pause the video to allow this bubble to be solved. Don't forget to press the finish button when you're done. If you're struggling, please look back at the previous bubbles to see how the draw loop is created. And also, please don't forget to run your code before you actually submit this code by pressing the orange finish button, because if it doesn't do like the model, it can't possibly be correct.